I call the relationship a marriage of convenience because these are two big countries sharing imperial histories, but also histories of conflict. And they've been rivals on a number of issues, but equally they've been able to cooperate in the field of economy, but also in security affairs. And they've grown mutually interdependent. We saw with the recent conflict that the costs for both parties, but certainly for Turkey, of direct confrontation are prohibitive. And that's why the leadership in both Moscow and Ankara have been very pragmatic and often risk-averse approaching the others. And that's what is at play right now, this marriage of convenience. So the crisis in Russian-Turkish relations occurred because of Turkish military plane shooting down a Russian jet at the border in Syria, which had strayed into Turkish airspace. That was November 2015, and it lasted until the summer of the next year, when the two leaders managed to start a process of rapprochement. Certainly, when Erdogan, after the coup, went to St. Petersburg for talks with Putin. And some of the legacy of the crisis is still around because some of the sanctions Russia imposed are still in place and on the agricultural exports from Turkey. I think it's the latter because in both countries the role of leadership and the personalistic mode of governance is very important. You cannot understate their importance. Very much that's the case in Russia, where Vladimir Putin is the decision maker in chief, and he has hollowed out institutions of governance, not just in foreign policy, but more broadly. And it's increasingly the case in Turkey, where the established mechanisms of decision making are more and more irrelevant. The foreign ministry is a shadow of its former self. We don't need to get into the discussion about the National Security Council, the role of the military. It's much more now around the presidential palace and the networks of influence around President Erdogan. So again, it's incumbent on those two leaders, and it seems that they have a good understanding of each other. They speak the same language of power, which is ironic because one thing that I want to underscore, and it's in my book as well, is that they inherited this relationship. It didn't happen when Putin got into the Kremlin and Erdogan gained power. It's a story that developed gradually in the 1990s, certainly by the end of the decade. So there was an institutionalized moment, and institutions did play a role. But again, going back to your question, it's a two-man show. It's the two leaders that set the tone, and that was likely to be the case for the foreseeable future, in that those two will remain in power, and that's a safe bet. Well, what's amazing about energy is that at the peak of the crisis, energy relations remained strong. I mean, Russia implemented sectoral sanctions, but they had nothing to do with the gas sector, which forms the bulk of trade exchanges. Of course, the pipeline Turkish Stream was cancelled or frozen for a while, but the big picture is that trade continued. So I think there's predictability. The other thing about energy is that it's a slow-moving trade. Very often foreign policy pundits look at game changers, look momentous events, but the logic of energy, the energy sector, has to do with structural forces and long-term trends, to do with supply and demand and economic conditions. And what we know is that Turkey is a growing economy, has a growing demographic, and it needs Russia as a supplier of, relatively reliable supplier of cheap energy. Compare Russia and Iran, which is number 2 when it comes to natural gas imports into Turkey. The commercial relationship between Turkey and Iran has been fraught with many disputes, and the infrastructure is deficient, and so on and so forth. So I think if I have to put my money on the next decade, Russia will be there very much in the picture. It might gain foothold in the nuclear sector, and this will continue to be the backbone of the economic, but also the political relationship. And the Turkish plan to wean itself out of dependence, to become not just a market for Russian energy exports. Again, Turkey is the second largest market for natural gas after Germany, and it's important for the Russians. But the plan of Turkey to become not just a transit country for energy resources from Central Asia and maybe the Middle East, but also some sort of trading hub, might prove to be a pipe dream, because it's incumbent on, again, structural forces, supply, demand, but also reform capacity and policy-making capacity in Turkey itself, which is a huge question mark. So let's not speculate and think about major breakthroughs. It might be more of the same in the foreseeable future. It's always been a fraught relationship. There was no golden era in US-Turkish relationship or transatlantic, except for the 1950s. Ever since, again, if you take the broad historical view, you see recurrent crisis. Maybe we have the worst crisis right now, and there are multiple reasons leading to that. But I don't think Russia and Turkey will become allies. So Russia is not an alternative for Turkey. What we see is the perennial quest of Turkish foreign policy makers, and certainly Erdogan, to secure political autonomy. So Turkey needs to be an independent player. This is the old lone wolf mentality that you have in Turkey, and Russia is an ally on occasion. Regarding the S-400 deal, we don't know if it's going to go through yet. There are many uncertainties. It's a small print, as in the energy trade, also in military defense contracts. There are lots of questions to do with the technology transfer, and there are divergent interests. Russia is not willing to surrender and to help the Turkish defense industries. And the other thing about NATO, last thing I want to say, is that, of course, in time of crisis, Turkey has seen its ties to NATO and the US deteriorating, but Turkey has accepted NATO's presence in the Black Sea after Ukraine. It has been very reticent, resisting NATOizing the Black Sea, but now it has accepted that NATO has a role, and it's the ultimate insurance policy for Turkish policymakers and Turkish security policy. So it needs to hedge its bets vis-a-vis Russia. And it needs NATO to secure itself against Russia, which is increasingly expansionist and willing to use military force in the neighborhood.